It's the 26th of February, and in this video I'm going to look at what should be done to all the soft fruit that I've got at this time of year ready for new growth. Now these are autumn raspberry stems, they're autumn treasure. I could have cut these back after we'd had all the fruit off of them in the autumn, but I haven't. And so I'm going to cut them down now. Because they're autumn fruiting raspberries, they develop their fruit on the stems that they grow on the year. So I'm going to cut these right down to the ground. New shoots, new stems are going to grow, and the raspberries are going to appear on that, which is different from the other variety, summer fruiting raspberries, where I'll show you some of those later in the fruit cage, that grew last year. The stems from which this year's fruit will come grew last year, so there's not a lot of work to do on those. One interesting thing you might notice about this compared to the other soft fruit other than the blackberries is that there's no fruit cage over them, and I found that, as with the blackberries, the autumn raspberries here in southern England, or at least in this garden, aren't very badly affected by the birds, or if they take some, there's more than enough for all of us, so there's been no need to net these. But anyway, onwards with cutting the autumn raspberry stems right back to the ground. There we are, that's all the raspberry stems cut back. I'll put a little bit of fertiliser down now, organic fertiliser, and top that up with a bit of a surface dressing once or twice during the growing season. This box here is not a raised bed. I do what I can to avoid having to do any weeding. It's not possible to put weed suppressant fabric down where raspberries are because they can come up anywhere, but I found that straw is quite an effective way of suppressing any weeds. So the purpose in life of these boxes is to stop the straw blowing away in the wind, and the other structure here is to support the raspberries when they get bigger, because as you saw a minute ago, the canes are quite tall, they need some kind of support. Or alternatively, I found a better method for me is to just let them all fall forwards onto that frame, and then that makes them a lot easier to pick. We're in the fruit cage now, and here's a couple of stems of summer raspberries. These grew last year, and the fruit will appear this summer. They also need support, and I've got those tied to wires. These are the beds for the strawberries. They've been here for very many years now, and I suppose in theory should be planted somewhere else, but as long as they keep coming up well every year, then they may as well stay. Of course they are regenerating, because the strawberry plants put out runners which self-plant. One of the purposes of these boxes is, again, they're not raised beds, is to encourage the shoots that come off of the strawberries to go back into the box where the earth is and plant themselves. Well, I haven't done anything at all to this since we harvested them last year. All I'm going to do now is a really sort of easy, cost-effective plants really, is just perhaps brush over the top of them to break the old dry leaves off, and the leaves can just fall down into the straw. The straw here is for two reasons. One of them, like with the raspberries, it's to suppress weeds, and it works extremely well in that respect. But also, unlike the raspberries, the strawberries grow very close to the ground, and if there's a layer of straw already there, they'll grow through the straw, and the strawberries will then rest on the straw so they don't get soggy or damaged by the ground. So I'm just going to finish knocking the leaves off. Then I'm going to put a little bit of fertiliser down, organic fertiliser, and then I'm going to put a new layer of straw for the new strawberries to grow through, and that's about it really. Couldn't be easier, strawberries. There we go, that's the straw down. Another reason for these boxes, as with the raspberries, is to stop the straw blowing away. Nothing else to do now except get some cream in around Wimbledon time. Okay, let's talk about gooseberries now. Gooseberries fruit on old wood, not on new stems that will grow this year, so one doesn't want to go too bonkers in cutting them back. In terms of cutting them back, the general rule is quite similar to all bushes, in that you're looking for open space in the centre, allow good air circulation. You don't want branches crossing each other, and you're looking all like this upturned goblet shape. So let's start a bit at a time. I mean, for example, this one here is crossing into the centre. One doesn't really want that there. That one's doing the same thing. In fact, I'm quite inclined to take out that whole centre section there. When you're cutting back the long sections like that are going in that direction, you think about where the bud is for the new growth, and I'm going to cut that so we've got a bud that's coming out and up, so it's kind of making this upward arched shape. And we'll cut that section back by about a third to an upward and outward facing bud. Quite often the most kind of artistic looking shape is the sort of shape you're looking for. I won't do all of it just at the moment, but the idea is to get open centres and a upward goblet shaped framework. There we go, I think that's as far as I want to go with that this year, and hopefully we should get a reasonable amount of gooseberries from that. I should have mentioned that gooseberries are self-fertile, so you can have one on their own. Raspberries and strawberries are too, although you don't normally get those hanging around individually. This is a blackcurrant. One of the wonderful things about blackcurrants is just standing next to it you get this sort of smell of blackcurrant even when there's no fruit on the bushes. The branches smell like that, particularly when you cut them. These are also self-fertile, so you can only have you only need to have one of them. What I'm going to do with this, I'm not going to do a whole lot with it. It's the same sort of thing about having an open centre, about stopping branches from crossing, about cutting off anything that was diseased, about getting a nice sort of shape to it. When they're a few years old, you might want to cut off some of the thicker stems from the base. Most of the good blackcurrants come from the the newer wood. So really I don't think there's a whole lot I really want to do with this year. Take off a few branches that are going in the wrong direction, but it's quite wide, it's quite open, and as with the other plants, if you do shorten any sections, take it to a nice outward bud, so you're trying to build this open goblet sort of shape.
Finally, in the fruit cage we've got blueberries. Some varieties are self-fertile, although it is generally recommended that you have two different varieties of blueberries, which I have here. One planted up the far end of the bed and one planted this end of the bed. The critical thing about blueberries, particularly in this garden, is that they're ericaceous, which means that they need to be in acidic soil. The wooden box that's around the roots of these blueberries is in fact a raised bed. There's ericaceous compost in the bed. I've been topping it up, it's at the top now, I've been topping it up each year with ericaceous compost. From next year I'll be using ericaceous fertiliser, and also they like well drained soil, so again having them in a raised bed is quite helpful in that respect. This was a short video on pruning, but I'm actually not going to prune them this year. They look to me to be fine, and if I imagine where the blueberries are going to be, I think they're going to be fine, and I think that may be a point to think about why one is pruning. I mean, you prune for a number of reasons. You prune because something's growing in a place you don't want it to grow. You prune because it helps the plant to develop better, as in opening up the centres to allow air circulation. You prune to get rid of diseased or damaged sections. You might prune in one way or another, either by cutting back old wood or by cutting back last year's growth. You might be attempting to get stronger, more vigorous growth, but you're always cutting for a reason, pruning for a reason. I think maybe it is quite useful whenever one prunes anything to look at it and say, why am I doing this? And looking around these blueberries this year, in fact this is only their third year, they have had a little bit of light pruning on recent years. Blueberries don't need a lot of pruning on the first couple of years, but I don't see any reason to touch those this year. We'll see how they come out, what the blueberries look like, but I'm just going to leave those. And now we're going to move on to the blackberries.
Finally, in this video I want to talk about blackberries. If you've not grown blackberries, I can give you a very useful piece of advice that I didn't know about when I first started to grow these, and that commercial growers use. The stems on this blackberry bush come in two varieties at the moment. One are the ones that the blackberries grew on last year, and the other stems are the stems that grew last year that the blackberries are going to come on this year, and they're two quite separate things. And to do it sensibly, you would have a frame with wires, and you would have all the ones that are about to bear fruit this year going off in one direction, and as the new ones grew for next year, you'd have them going off in the other direction, so you'd keep your new stems and your fruiting stems completely separate, and then at the end of the season you would cut away all the old ones that had borne fruit, and you'd have the others ready for next year, and then on the following year those would bear fruit, and you'd have the stems in the other direction as they were growing ready for the year after.
Sadly, I don't have that system. Here's a close-up example of the old branches. where the blackberries were last year, and that will need to be taken out. Here's an example of last year's growth from which the new blackberries are going to come this year. One of the great advantages of trimming the blackberries this time of the year in early spring is that you can see very clearly the difference between the old decayed branches, and you can see which new ones are coming through and there's bits of new growth, so there's no doubt about which things need to be trimmed out and which don't.
Okay, well the first thing to do is to cut off all of the branches that fruited last year. Well, I've now cut back all the old dead branches, and what we've got now are all the branches that are showing signs of life and getting ready to produce fruit this year. The thing I am going to do now is to wrap the branches into the frame, just to try and tidy it up a bit, make it a bit more manageable. Well, that's got the blackberries in some kind of order, not very artistic perhaps, but it might help to some extent to keep them under control. I'm sure you'll probably do better with your blackberries. Thank you for watching. I hope you've got at least one thing from this video that's either new to you or inspires you to do something else, and I'll see you next time